Picture this. You're standing in the opulent chambers of Versailles in the year 1685, and what you witness makes your stomach turn. The most beautiful woman in all of France, a queen whose porcelain complexion is envied across Europe, is having mercury rubbed into her face by trembling servants. The metallic poison burns her skin, leaving angry red welts that will take weeks to heal. But she endures this agony willingly, desperately, because medieval beauty standards demanded perfection at any cost, even if that cost was her sanity, her health, or ultimately her life. You see, when we think of medieval queens, we imagine fairy tale princesses with naturally glowing skin and effortless grace. But the horrifying truth is that these women subjected themselves to beauty rituals so gruesome, so dangerous, and so psychologically damaging that they would make modern cosmetic procedures look like child's play. What you're about to discover isn't just vanity gone wrong. It's a window into how the pursuit of beauty became a form of slow-motion suicide practiced by the most powerful women in history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of beauty and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. The story begins in the courts of medieval Europe, where beauty wasn't just about attraction, it was about survival. Queens and noblewomen understood that their faces were their most valuable political assets. A beautiful queen could secure alliances, prevent wars, and maintain her husband's favor. An aging or scarred queen might find herself replaced, exiled, or worse. This created a desperate arms race where women would try anything, no matter how dangerous, to maintain their youthful appearance. But medieval beauty standards were unlike anything we recognize today. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was mandatory. A tan suggested you worked in fields like a peasant. High foreheads were considered the pinnacle of elegance, leading women to pluck their hairlines back by inches. Thin eyebrows showed refinement, while thick ones marked you as common. Red lips indicated health and fertility, but achieving the perfect shade required ingredients that would literally poison the wearer over time. The most coveted beauty ingredient in medieval Europe was something that would horrify modern women: white lead. This toxic metal, mixed with vinegar to create a paste called ceruse, was applied to faces, necks, and hands to achieve that coveted porcelain complexion. Queens would have servants apply this mixture every morning, creating a mask so thick it could crack when they smiled. The lead would seep through their skin, accumulating in their organs over months and years. Imagine waking up each day, knowing that your beauty routine was slowly killing you, but being unable to stop because your political survival depended on maintaining your appearance. Court painters from this era show us queens with unnaturally white faces, but they couldn't capture the reality behind that perfection. The trembling hands from mercury poisoning, the hair loss from chemical burns, the gradual madness that came from chronic heavy metal exposure. Queen Elizabeth I of England became the most famous victim of lead-based cosmetics. By the end of her reign, courtiers reported that her face paint was nearly an inch thick, and removing it required special solvents that burned her skin. She suffered from hair loss so severe that she owned over 80 wigs, and her teeth had turned black from the constant chemical exposure. Yet she continued this routine for decades because her image as the Virgin Queen required her to appear ageless and divine. But lead poisoning was just the beginning of medieval beauty horror. Queens seeking to lighten their complexions would bathe in solutions containing arsenic, another deadly poison that promised to bleach skin from the inside out. They would consume small amounts daily, building up tolerance while their bodies slowly accumulated this toxic metal. The side effects were devastating: violent stomach pain, hair falling out in clumps, and eventually organ failure. But the promise of perfect pale skin made these risks seem worthwhile. The pursuit of the ideal medieval forehead created its own category of suffering. Since high foreheads were considered beautiful, queens would undergo procedures to permanently remove their hairlines. This wasn't simple plucking. Court physicians would use heated needles to destroy hair follicles or apply caustic chemicals that would burn away unwanted hair along with layers of skin. The process was so painful that women would bite down on leather straps to avoid screaming during treatment. Some queens took even more extreme measures, having their hairlines surgically altered with primitive tools that often led to infection and scarring. Court records describe women spending weeks in recovery, their foreheads wrapped in bandages soaked with wine and herbs, praying that the swelling would subside without permanent disfigurement. Many developed chronic headaches from the nerve damage, while others suffered from recurring infections that could turn fatal. The medieval obsession with tiny waists created another realm of beauty torture. Queens would begin wearing increasingly tight corsets from childhood, gradually reshaping their rib cages over years of constant compression. These weren't the relatively gentle corsets of later periods. Medieval versions were constructed with whalebone or metal stays that could literally crack ribs if laced too tightly. Court physicians regularly treated noble women for crushed organs, difficulty breathing, and internal bleeding caused by their pursuit of the perfect silhouette. Young princesses would be fitted with training corsets before their bodies had finished developing, permanently altering their bone structure. Their ribs would grow inward, compressing their lungs and hearts into smaller spaces. Some queens could barely climb stairs without becoming breathless, while others fainted regularly from the restriction of their circulation. Yet removing these corsets, even temporarily, was considered scandalous. A queen's tiny waist was visible proof of her refinement and self-control. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging beauty ritual involved the medieval practice of bloodletting for cosmetic purposes. Queens believed that removing blood would improve their complexions by balancing their humours and creating that coveted pale appearance. Court physicians would make incisions in arms, legs, or even faces, allowing blood to drain into bowls while the queen lay motionless for hours. This wasn't the controlled medical bloodletting practiced for illness. Cosmetic bloodletting was far more extreme. Queens would lose dangerous amounts of blood in pursuit of beauty, leaving them weak, anemic, and vulnerable to infection. Some sessions would remove so much blood that women would lose consciousness, yet they would schedule these procedures regularly, convinced that their complexions improved with each treatment. The tools used for these beauty rituals were as frightening as the procedures themselves. Medieval cosmetic implements looked more like torture devices than beauty tools. Heated metal rods for hair removal, sharp needles for extracting blackheads, and caustic solutions that could burn through skin were all standard equipment in a queen's beauty arsenal. Servants who applied these treatments often wore gloves and masks to protect themselves from the very substances they were spreading on their mistresses' faces. Court records reveal that many queens maintained private torture chambers disguised as beauty salons, hidden away from public view, where they could undergo their most extreme treatments in secrecy. These rooms contained restraining devices to hold patients still during painful procedures, collections of sharp instruments that resembled surgical tools, and ventilation systems to clear away toxic fumes from chemical treatments. The psychological toll of these beauty rituals was immense. Queens lived in constant fear that their appearance was deteriorating, leading to obsessive behaviours that consumed their daily lives. They would spend hours examining their faces in mirrors, searching for new flaws that required treatment. Some developed what we would now recognise as body dysmorphic disorder, seeing imperfections that existed only in their minds, but drove them to ever more extreme measures. The secrecy surrounding these beauty practices created additional psychological pressure. Queens could never admit to the extent of their cosmetic interventions. Their beauty was supposed to appear natural and divinely granted. This meant enduring agonizing treatments in silence, pretending that their perfect complexions required no effort, while privately suffering through procedures that left them scarred and sick. Court physicians who served medieval queens often became complicit in these beauty obsessions, developing increasingly dangerous treatments to satisfy their royal patrons' demands. They would experiment with new combinations of toxic chemicals, testing them on servants before applying them to their queens. These early cosmetic chemists kept detailed records of their formulations, creating recipes for beauty treatments that read like instructions for slow-motion poisoning. The competition between courts across Europe escalated these beauty practices to even more dangerous levels. When one queen appeared with a particularly pale complexion or fashionable forehead, rivals would demand that their physicians create even more extreme versions of the same treatments. This created an arms race of cosmetic experimentation, where each court tried to outdo the others in achieving impossible beauty standards. The servants who assisted with these beauty rituals often paid their own price for their queen's vanity. Many developed chronic illnesses from handling toxic cosmetics daily, while others suffered burns and injuries from the dangerous tools they were required to use. Some were sworn to secrecy about their mistress's beauty practices under threat of death, creating a culture of fear and complicity that allowed these dangerous rituals to continue unchecked. As we delve deeper into these forgotten chapters of medieval history, the true cost of beauty becomes clear. These weren't just cosmetic procedures. They were systematic forms of self-destruction practiced by the most powerful women of their time. The queens who subjected themselves to these rituals were trapped by impossible standards that demanded perfection at any cost, even when that cost was their own lives. The competition for beauty reached its most horrifying peak during the reign of Catherine de' Medici in 16th century France. Catherine, desperate to maintain her influence over her sons who ruled as kings, pioneered beauty techniques so extreme they would make modern plastic surgery seem gentle by comparison. She established what historians call the first cosmetic laboratory in European royal history, a secret chamber beneath the Louvre, where she and her team of Italian alchemists developed increasingly dangerous formulations. Catherine's laboratory became a nightmare workshop where live animals were used to test new cosmetic compounds before they were applied to human skin. Rabbits would be painted with experimental face powders to observe the effects of prolonged exposure, while cats had their fur removed using prototype hair removal solutions. The mortality rate among these test subjects was catastrophic, but Catherine viewed this as necessary sacrifice in her pursuit of eternal youth. The Queen's most infamous creation was a face mask made from crushed pearls, mercury, and the blood of virgin lambs. This mixture, applied weekly for hours at a time, promised to restore youthful elasticity to aging skin. The process was excruciating. The mercury would burn like acid while the crushed pearls acted as an abrasive that literally scraped away layers of facial tissue. Catherine would lie motionless for up to 6 hours while this toxic paste ate away at her face, convinced that her suffering was the price of maintaining royal beauty. But Catherine's innovations extended beyond facial treatments into the realm of body modification that bordered on surgical mutilation. She developed a technique for permanently narrowing the nose using heated metal clamps that would be applied to the cartilage for weeks at a time. The pressure would gradually crush the nasal structure into the desired shape. But the process often resulted in breathing difficulties and chronic sinus infections that plagued victims for the rest of their lives. Young noblewomen at Catherine's court were encouraged to undergo this nasal reshaping as part of their preparation for marriage negotiations. The procedure took place in a specially constructed room where screams couldn't be heard by other courtiers. Patients would be strapped to tables, while heated metal devices slowly compressed their noses over the course of several days. Many lost consciousness from the pain, while others developed infections that spread to their brains, causing permanent mental damage or death. The obsession with achieving perfect lips led to perhaps the most psychologically disturbing beauty practice of the medieval period. Queens would have their servants use tiny needles to inject various substances directly into their lip tissue, attempting to achieve the perfect shade of red and the ideal fullness. These early lip injections used everything from crushed beetles to extract vivid crimson dyes to mercury compounds that promised to plump the tissue permanently. The injection process was primitive and dangerous. Without any understanding of sterile technique, courtiers would use the same needles repeatedly, spreading infections and diseases between patients. The substances injected were often toxic, causing lips to swell grotesquely before eventually necrotizing and falling away entirely. Some queens lost portions of their lips to gangrene, requiring them to wear elaborate veils for the remainder of their lives to hide their disfigurement. Queen Isabella of Castile became legendary for her pursuit of perfect eyebrows, which medieval beauty standards demanded be thin as silk threads and positioned impossibly high on the forehead. To achieve this look, she would have servants pluck out every hair from her natural brow line, then use heated needles to create individual holes higher up on her forehead where new eyebrow hairs could be implanted. This procedure required harvesting hair from other parts of her body and manually inserting each strand into the puncture wounds created by the needles. The eyebrow implantation process was repeated monthly, as the transplanted hairs would often fail to take root or become infected. Isabella's forehead became a landscape of scars and puncture wounds, yet she continued the practice for over a decade. Court painters from this period show her with impossibly high, thin eyebrows, but they couldn't capture the reality of the scarred and damaged skin that lay beneath her thick face paint. The medieval pursuit of perfect teeth created its own category of dental horror. Queens would have their teeth filed into points or perfect squares to match the fashionable shape of the era. This filing process removed the protective enamel, leaving the underlying dentin exposed to decay and infection. Many queens developed abscesses so severe they would cause facial swelling and constant agony, yet they continued filing their teeth to maintain the fashionable appearance. Some courtiers took dental modification even further, having perfectly healthy teeth extracted and replaced with teeth carved from ivory or the bones of exotic animals. These replacement teeth were held in place with gold wire that often cut into the gums, causing chronic bleeding and infections. The ivory teeth would gradually yellow and decay, requiring frequent replacement and creating a cycle of dental mutilation that lasted for years. The medieval obsession with achieving pale, translucent skin led to the development of skin bleaching techniques that went far beyond simple cosmetic applications. Queens would undergo procedures where their skin was deliberately burned with mild acids, then allowed to heal in darkness to achieve a paler complexion. This controlled burning process was repeated multiple times, each session removing another layer of pigmented skin in the hope of revealing lighter tissue beneath. These acid treatments were applied not just to faces, but to entire bodies. Queens would spend weeks in darkened chambers while their burned skin slowly healed, attended by servants who would apply cooling salves and monitor for signs of infection. The process was so painful that many patients required opium or other primitive painkillers to endure the healing period. Some developed permanent scarring that created a mottled, uneven skin tone that required even more cosmetic intervention to conceal. The pursuit of fashionably small feet led to practices that paralleled the Chinese tradition of foot binding, but were uniquely European in their brutality. Young princesses would have their feet bound with metal restraints that prevented normal growth and development. Unlike cloth binding, these metal devices could be tightened progressively to achieve increasingly dramatic results, often crushing bones and permanently damaging the foot structure. The metal foot restraints were designed to create feet so small they could barely support the wearer's weight. Walking became a carefully choreographed performance where each step had to be planned and executed with precision to avoid falling. Many queens required the assistance of servants to move around their palaces, leaning heavily on attendants to maintain their balance while displaying their fashionably tiny feet. The psychological impact of these beauty practices extended beyond the immediate physical suffering to create lasting mental damage that affected every aspect of a queen's life. The constant pain from various cosmetic procedures made normal activities impossible. Simple tasks like eating became challenges when facial treatments left mouths swollen and painful. Sleep was frequently interrupted by throbbing pain from recent procedures or the discomfort of restraining devices that had to be worn overnight. The isolation required for many beauty treatments created additional psychological stress. Queens would spend weeks in darkened chambers recovering from procedures, cut off from human contact except for the servants who attended to their medical needs. This enforced solitude, combined with constant physical pain, led many to develop what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. The financial cost of these beauty obsessions was staggering, often consuming significant portions of royal treasuries. Queens would spend fortunes importing exotic ingredients from distant lands, hiring specialists from across Europe, and commissioning specialized equipment for their cosmetic procedures. The expense of maintaining these beauty regimens sometimes exceeded the cost of military campaigns. Yet queens viewed these expenditures as essential investments in their political survival. Some queens became so addicted to their beauty rituals that they would continue treatments even when their kingdoms faced financial crisis or military threats. Court records show instances where queens refused to reduce their cosmetic budgets even when their subjects were starving, or their armies lacked adequate supplies. The pursuit of beauty had become more important than the basic functions of governance. The secrecy surrounding these practices created a culture of conspiracy and paranoia within royal courts. Queens would go to extraordinary lengths to conceal the extent of their cosmetic interventions, using threats and bribes to ensure their servants' silence. Some beauty practitioners were kept as virtual prisoners within palace walls to prevent them from sharing royal beauty secrets with rival courts. This obsession with secrecy led to the development of elaborate protocols for disguising the evidence of cosmetic procedures. Queens would schedule important public appearances around their beauty treatments, timing diplomatic meetings and court ceremonies to avoid periods when they would be visibly recovering from procedures. They became masters of deception, using makeup, lighting, and carefully choreographed public appearances to maintain the illusion that their beauty was entirely natural. The competitive nature of medieval court life meant that queens were constantly comparing their appearances to rivals and seeking new ways to gain cosmetic advantages. This created an escalating cycle where each new beauty innovation had to be more extreme than the last to maintain its effectiveness. What began as simple cosmetic enhancement gradually evolved into increasingly dangerous forms of body modification that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. As these beauty practices became more extreme, they began to attract the attention of religious authorities who viewed such vanity as sinful. However, most queens found ways to justify their cosmetic obsessions in religious terms, arguing that maintaining their beauty was necessary to fulfill their God-given roles as rulers. Some even claimed that their beauty rituals were forms of religious devotion, enduring suffering in the service of divine perfection. The legacy of these medieval beauty practices would echo through subsequent centuries, influencing cosmetic traditions that persisted well into the modern era. The techniques developed in medieval courts laid the groundwork for many later beauty innovations, though thankfully most of the more dangerous practices were eventually abandoned as medical knowledge advanced and safer alternatives became available. The influence of these beauty obsessions extended beyond individual queens to reshape entire court cultures across medieval Europe. When Marie of Burgundy arrived at the French court in 1477, She brought with her a collection of beauty instruments that would horrify modern observers. Her personal cosmetic kit included razor-sharp bone scrapers for removing dead skin, heated metal rods for cauterizing unwanted hair follicles, and vials of concentrated acids that could eat through flesh in seconds. Marie's signature beauty innovation was a technique she called skin renewal that involved deliberately creating controlled burns across her entire body using heated copper plates. The theory was that destroying the outer layer of skin would allow fresh, youthful tissue to grow in its place. The reality was weeks of agony as her burned flesh slowly healed, often leaving permanent scarring that required even more cosmetic intervention to conceal. The procedure took place in a specially constructed chamber lined with mirrors so Marie could observe every inch of her body during treatment. Servants would heat the copper plates over open flames until they glowed red hot, then press them against predetermined areas of her skin for precisely timed intervals. The smell of burning flesh would fill the chamber, while Marie lay motionless, biting down on leather straps to muffle her screams. What made this practice particularly disturbing was its systematic nature. Marie had developed detailed charts mapping every inch of her body, with schedules indicating when each area should receive treatment to maintain optimal appearance. Her servants kept meticulous records of burn patterns, healing times, and cosmetic results, creating what amounted to a scientific study of deliberate self-mutilation. Other queens quickly adopted variations of Marie's skin renewal technique, each trying to improve upon the original method. Some experimented with different metals, believing that gold or silver plates would produce superior results. Others varied the temperature and duration of contact, seeking the perfect balance between effective tissue destruction and survivable damage. The psychological preparation required for these treatments was almost as disturbing as the procedures themselves. Queens would spend days mentally preparing for sessions they knew would cause excruciating pain. They developed elaborate rituals involving prayer, meditation, and consumption of numbing herbs to help them endure what they were about to experience. Court physicians during this era found themselves in impossible positions, torn between their medical training and their queen's demands for increasingly dangerous beauty treatments. Many kept secret journals documenting the horrific effects of these cosmetic procedures, while publicly supporting practices they knew were causing permanent damage to their patients. Dr. Guillaume de Montpellier, who served 3 successive French queens, left behind detailed accounts of the cosmetic horrors he witnessed. His private writings describe queens whose faces had been so damaged by chemical treatments that they could barely speak or eat solid food. He documented cases of mercury poisoning so severe that patients experienced hallucinations and violent mood swings, yet continued their beauty regimens even as their mental faculties deteriorated. The most chilling aspect of these medical records is how they reveal the gradual normalization of extreme suffering in pursuit of beauty. What began as shocking and unprecedented procedures gradually became routine court activities that were scheduled alongside diplomatic meetings and religious ceremonies. The systematic nature of this self-destruction suggests a level of psychological conditioning that went far beyond simple vanity. The international nature of medieval royal marriages meant that these dangerous beauty practices spread rapidly across European courts. When Princess Anna of Bohemia married Richard II of England, she brought with her a team of cosmetic specialists who introduced English nobility to techniques previously unknown in Britain. These foreign beauty experts were treated like valuable military assets, closely guarded and prevented from sharing their knowledge with rival kingdoms. Anna's signature contribution to English court beauty was a hair removal technique that used a combination of boiling resin and caustic chemicals to permanently destroy unwanted body hair. The process involved painting the chemical mixture onto skin, then covering it with heated cloth that would bond to the hair follicles. When the cloth was ripped away, it would remove not just the hair, but often layers of skin and underlying tissue. This hair removal method was so painful that it required multiple assistants to hold patients down during treatment. The chemical burns left by the process often became infected, leading to scarring and permanent skin discoloration. Some courtiers lost fingers or toes when infections from these treatments spread beyond the original application sites. The psychological impact of watching other women undergo these procedures was profound. Young noblewomen would observe their elders enduring unspeakable agony in pursuit of beauty, understanding that they too would eventually be expected to submit to similar treatments. This created a culture of anticipatory dread, where the promise of future suffering overshadowed present happiness. Court records from this period reveal that many young women developed severe anxiety disorders while awaiting their first major cosmetic procedures. Some attempted to delay these treatments through various excuses, while others requested to be sedated with dangerous amounts of alcohol or opium during procedures. The psychological preparation for cosmetic treatments became almost as elaborate as the physical procedures themselves. The seasonal nature of many beauty treatments created additional psychological pressure. Certain procedures could only be performed during winter months, when queens could remain hidden while recovering from visible damage. This meant that the approach of spring would trigger intense anxiety as women rushed to complete their cosmetic preparations before the social season began. The winter beauty season became a period of systematic self-torture as courts competed to see who could endure the most extreme treatments. Queens would schedule multiple procedures simultaneously, combining facial acid treatments with body modification and dental work in marathon sessions that could last for days. Survival of these comprehensive beauty overhauls became a mark of status and determination. The tools and techniques developed during these winter beauty seasons represent some of the most sophisticated torture devices in human history. Medieval cosmetic instruments were crafted with the same precision and attention to detail as weapons of war. Master craftsmen competed to create increasingly refined implements for causing controlled, cosmetically beneficial damage to human tissue. The Guild of Court Beauticians, established in Paris during the late 14th century, developed standardized techniques for the most popular cosmetic procedures. Their training manuals, preserved in monastery archives, read like instructions for medieval torture methods. Detailed illustrations show proper techniques for facial skin removal, methods for achieving optimal bone crushing during foot modification, and precise angles for inserting needles into lip tissue. These professional beauticians were required to swear oaths of secrecy regarding their techniques and their clients' procedures. Breaking these oaths was punishable by death, creating a closed system where dangerous practices could evolve without outside scrutiny or medical oversight. The Guild maintained its own private hospitals, where members could recover from experimental procedures without risking public exposure. The financial structure supporting these beauty obsessions created entire economies based on human suffering. Merchants specialized in importing toxic cosmetic ingredients from distant lands, often at prices that exceeded those of precious metals. The rarity and danger of these substances only increased their desirability among queens seeking the ultimate beauty advantage. Professional cosmetic ingredient hunters would travel to remote regions seeking new sources of beauty-enhancing poisons. They would negotiate with tribal healers for access to plant toxins, mine operators for rare metals, and even grave robbers for human-derived beauty components. These exotic ingredients were then transported across continents at enormous expense and risk. The cosmetic supply chain became so lucrative that entire trading routes were established specifically to serve the beauty needs of European courts. Ships would carry nothing but cosmetic ingredients protected by armed guards, who understood that their cargo was more valuable than gold. Pirates began specializing in capturing these beauty supply vessels, knowing that queens would pay any ransom to recover their precious cosmetic materials. The competitive pressure between courts meant that beauty innovations had to be kept secret until they could be deployed for maximum political advantage. Queens would time the revelation of new cosmetic techniques to coincide with important diplomatic negotiations, using their enhanced appearance as a psychological weapon against rivals. The element of surprise became crucial in cosmetic warfare between kingdoms. Some queens developed elaborate deception campaigns designed to mislead rivals about their beauty techniques. They would deliberately spread false information about their cosmetic procedures while secretly using entirely different methods. Court spies specialized in cosmetic intelligence, attempting to discover the beauty secrets of foreign queens through infiltration and bribery. The international trade in beauty secrets became as complex and dangerous as military espionage. Professional cosmetic spies would spend years gaining access to foreign courts, posing as servants or minor nobility, while secretly documenting the beauty practices they observed. Some were discovered and executed as traitors, while others successfully returned home with intelligence that could reshape their own kingdom's approach to royal beauty. The psychological warfare aspect of medieval beauty culture created additional pressure for increasingly extreme practices. Queens understood that appearing at diplomatic functions with obviously superior beauty could intimidate rivals and strengthen their negotiating positions. This meant that major political events became showcases for the most extreme cosmetic achievements each court could produce. The preparation for these high-stakes beauty competitions often took months of intensive treatment. Queens would undergo comprehensive cosmetic overhauls designed to address every aspect of their appearance simultaneously. The coordination required to manage multiple dangerous procedures while maintaining the Queen's health and sanity demanded tremendous skill from court physicians and beauty specialists. The aftermath of these cosmetic competitions could be devastating for losing queens. Those whose beauty failed to measure up to their rivals often faced political consequences that went far beyond personal embarrassment. Diplomatic marriages might be cancelled, military alliances could crumble, and entire kingdoms might find themselves isolated based on their queen's cosmetic inadequacies. This political dimension of beauty culture meant that queens could never afford to relax their cosmetic vigilance. Even during periods of relative peace, they had to maintain their beauty regimens in preparation for unexpected diplomatic challenges. The constant pressure to remain cosmetically competitive created a lifestyle of perpetual suffering that continued until death provided the only possible release. The servants who supported these beauty obsessions developed their own psychological coping mechanisms to deal with the horrors they witnessed daily. Many turned to alcohol or religious extremism to numb themselves to their participation in systematic torture. Others developed elaborate justifications for their actions, convincing themselves that they were serving a higher purpose by helping their queens achieve political success through enhanced beauty. The training required to become a skilled cosmetic servant was itself a form of psychological conditioning designed to overcome natural human revulsion at causing pain. New servants would begin by observing procedures from a distance, gradually being moved closer until they could participate directly without becoming physically ill. This desensitization process could take years to complete. The most experienced cosmetic servants were often former victims of these procedures themselves, women who had survived their own beauty ordeals and now possessed the psychological fortitude to inflict similar suffering on others. These veterans understood intimately what their queens were experiencing, which made them both more effective assistants and more psychologically damaged individuals. Their faces bore the scars of their own cosmetic histories, serving as living advertisements for the techniques they now administered to others. The seasonal cycle of court beauty reached its most grotesque expression during the pre-Easter purification rituals that became popular in 15th century courts. Queens believed that spiritual cleansing required physical suffering, leading to the development of beauty treatments that combined religious penance with cosmetic enhancement. These procedures were justified as acts of devotion while secretly serving the queen's vanity. The Easter beauty rituals involved systematic flagellation of the skin using specialized whips embedded with tiny metal fragments. The theory was that the controlled damage would stimulate blood flow and create a healthy glow while simultaneously providing spiritual purification through suffering. Queens would spend weeks covered in carefully administered wounds, that were treated with exotic salves designed to promote healing while preventing scarring. The religious justification for these practices allowed queens to undergo extreme cosmetic procedures while maintaining their pious reputations. Court chaplains would bless the instruments of beauty torture, transforming torture devices into holy relics that carried divine approval. This fusion of religion and vanity created a particularly twisted form of self-destruction that was celebrated rather than questioned. Marguerite of Anjou pioneered the practice of cosmetic pilgrimage, traveling to distant shrines while undergoing beauty treatments that were timed to coincide with religious observances. Her most famous journey involved walking barefoot across France while wearing a metal corset that gradually tightened each day of the pilgrimage. By the time she reached her destination, the device had compressed her ribcage so severely that she could barely breathe, yet she proclaimed this suffering a divine blessing. These cosmetic pilgrimages became competitive events where queens would attempt to outdo each other in combining religious devotion with beauty enhancement. Some would carry heavy cosmetic equipment as additional penance, while others would undergo daily beauty procedures at each shrine they visited. The physical demands of these journeys, combined with ongoing cosmetic treatments, created a deadly combination that claimed the lives of several participants. The development of portable beauty equipment allowed these traveling torture sessions to maintain their intensity regardless of location. Specialized craftsmen created collapsible devices that could be assembled quickly at temporary locations, ensuring that queens never had to interrupt their beauty regimens, even during the most demanding pilgrimages. These traveling kits contained everything needed for major cosmetic procedures, from heated metal implements to vials of concentrated acids. The psychological pressure of maintaining beauty standards while traveling created additional stress for queens who understood that any visible decline in their appearance could be interpreted as divine displeasure. They would often undergo more extreme procedures while on pilgrimage, believing that the religious setting would provide divine protection against the worst consequences of their cosmetic experiments. Court physicians accompanying these pilgrimages found themselves practicing medicine under impossible conditions, attempting to treat the effects of dangerous beauty procedures while lacking proper facilities or supplies. Many developed innovative field techniques for managing cosmetic emergencies, creating a specialized branch of medieval medicine focused entirely on beauty-related injuries and complications. The intersection of beauty culture with medieval warfare created perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of these practices. Queens whose kingdoms were under threat would often intensify their beauty regimens, believing that enhanced appearance would somehow protect them from military defeat. The logic was that divine favor, demonstrated through perfect beauty, would ensure victory in battle. Eleanor of Aquitaine became legendary for her pre-battle beauty rituals, which involved having her entire body painted with a mixture of mercury and crushed gemstones that was supposed to make her invulnerable to enemy weapons. The process took hours and left her skin burning with chemical burns, but she would ride into battle gleaming like a metallic goddess while internally suffering from severe poisoning. These warrior queens developed beauty practices specifically designed to intimidate enemies through supernatural appearance. They would undergo procedures that left them looking inhuman, faces painted with metallic substances that reflected light unnaturally, hair treated with chemicals that made it appear to move independently, and skin modifications that created an otherworldly appearance calculated to strike fear into opposing forces. The psychological effect of these battle beauty rituals on the queens themselves was profound. They would enter combat already weakened by cosmetic procedures, their judgment impaired by pain and chemical poisoning, yet convinced that their enhanced appearance made them invincible. This combination of physical vulnerability and psychological overconfidence led to military disasters that could have been avoided with clearer thinking The aftermath of military defeats often triggered even more extreme beauty practices, as queens sought to understand why their cosmetic preparations had failed to ensure victory. They would blame insufficient suffering or inadequate procedures, leading to escalating cycles of self-punishment that were justified as necessary preparation for future conflicts. The development of siege beauty became a particularly twisted practice, where queens under military blockade would use their enforced isolation to undergo the most extreme cosmetic procedures possible. With no need to appear in public and unlimited time for recovery, these siege periods became opportunities for comprehensive beauty overhauls that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Queens trapped in besieged castles would transform their confinement into intensive beauty retreats, emerging months later with dramatically altered appearances that shocked both allies and enemies. These transformations were often so extreme that the queens were barely recognizable, leading to rumors that they had been replaced by imposters or had made supernatural bargains for enhanced beauty. The psychological impact of emerging from siege with radically altered appearance created additional challenges for queens who found that their subjects no longer recognized them. Some had to undergo gradual reverse procedures to restore enough of their original appearance to be accepted as legitimate rulers, while others embraced their new identities and ruled as essentially different people. The siege beauty phenomenon created a new category of cosmetic procedure specifically designed for extended isolation periods. These treatments required months or even years to complete, involving gradual modifications that could only be achieved through sustained, systematic alteration of physical features. The extended timeframes allowed for more dramatic changes, but also increased the risk of permanent damage or death from cumulative effects. Court records from besieged castles reveal the elaborate planning required to maintain beauty treatments under military pressure. Queens would stockpile cosmetic supplies alongside food and weapons, sometimes prioritizing beauty materials over military necessities. The dedication required to continue painful cosmetic procedures while under enemy attack demonstrates the complete psychological dominance these beauty obsessions had achieved. The international diplomatic implications of siege beauty created additional complications for medieval warfare. Enemy commanders would sometimes extend sieges specifically to observe the cosmetic transformations occurring within besieged castles, treating these beauty experiments as intelligence-gathering opportunities that could provide insights into their opponent's psychological state and strategic priorities. The emergence of queens from prolonged sieges with dramatically altered appearances often changed the entire dynamic of military conflicts. Enemies who had expected to negotiate with familiar opponents found themselves facing what appeared to be entirely different individuals, requiring new diplomatic strategies and sometimes leading to renewed hostilities based on mistaken identity or supernatural fears. The practice of documentation. These siege beauty transformations created some of the most detailed records of medieval cosmetic procedures that survive today. Queens would have their alterations carefully recorded by court artists and physicians, creating before and after documentation that served both as personal records and as diplomatic tools for intimidating future enemies. The psychological preparation required for siege beauty was particularly intense because queens understood that they were committing to irreversible changes while under extreme stress. The combination of military pressure and cosmetic transformation created mental states that court physicians struggled to understand or treat, leading to the development of specialized techniques for managing beauty-related psychological disorders. The training of siege beauty specialists became a crucial military preparation, with courts maintaining teams of cosmetic experts who could function effectively under combat conditions. These specialists had to master their techniques while dealing with limited supplies, enemy attacks, and patients who were already psychologically unstable from military stress and prolonged cosmetic procedures. The economic implications of siege beauty created additional burdens for kingdoms already strained by military expenses. The cost of maintaining elaborate beauty treatments during extended sieges often exceeded the cost of defending the castle itself, yet queens viewed these expenditures as essential investments in their post-siege political survival and psychological recovery. The legacy of siege beauty practices influenced medieval architecture, with castle designers incorporating specialized chambers designed specifically for extended cosmetic procedures. These beauty bunkers were constructed with multiple escape routes, ventilation systems for toxic fumes, and storage areas for the massive quantities of supplies required for months or years of intensive cosmetic treatments. The psychological profile of queens who survived siege beauty transformations reveals the extreme mental conditioning required to endure such ordeals. These women developed almost superhuman pain tolerance and psychological resilience, but often at the cost of normal emotional responses and social connections. They became living monuments to the power of human determination, while simultaneously serving as warnings about the dangers of unchecked vanity. The international community of medieval courts watched these siege beauty experiments with fascination and horror, understanding that they were witnessing the evolution of cosmetic practices that pushed beyond all previous boundaries of human endurance. The knowledge gained from these extreme procedures would influence beauty culture across Europe for generations, establishing new standards for what queens might be expected to suffer in pursuit of perfect appearance. The servants who participated in siege beauty procedures often developed their own psychological disorders from witnessing and facilitating such extreme transformations. Many required years of recovery after siege experiences, while others never fully recovered from their participation in what amounted to systematic torture, disguised as beauty enhancement. The psychological casualties among beauty servants became a hidden cost of these practices that was rarely acknowledged or treated. The medical innovations developed during siege beauty procedures advanced medieval understanding of human anatomy and pain tolerance in ways that would influence surgical techniques for centuries. However, this knowledge came at the cost of tremendous human suffering and created ethical dilemmas that medieval physicians were not equipped to address or resolve. As these beauty practices reached their most extreme expressions, they began to attract criticism from unexpected sources within medieval society. However, the institutional power of queens and the economic interests supporting the beauty industry made meaningful reform almost impossible, ensuring that these practices would continue to evolve in increasingly dangerous directions. The cultural normalization of extreme beauty suffering had reached a point where practices that would have shocked earlier generations were accepted as routine aspects of royal life. This gradual escalation demonstrates how societies can adapt to almost any level of systematic cruelty when it becomes institutionalized and economically profitable. The international spread of these practices created a form of cultural contamination where dangerous beauty techniques crossed borders faster than military innovations or technological advances. The appeal of enhanced beauty created demand that overcame cultural barriers and religious objections, establishing these practices across diverse European societies. The documentation of these beauty practices in court records, medical texts, and artistic works created a historical legacy that would influence cosmetic culture for centuries. However, much of this documentation was deliberately obscured or destroyed by later generations, who recognized the disturbing nature of these practices and sought to conceal this dark chapter of medieval history. The psychological impact of these beauty cultures extended beyond individual queens to influence entire court societies where normal human relationships became impossible under the pressure of constant cosmetic competition and the fear of revealing the true extent of one's suffering. These courts became theatres of deception, where everyone participated in maintaining elaborate fictions about the natural beauty of their rulers, while privately knowing the horrific truth behind their perfect appearances. The most chilling aspect of medieval beauty culture was how it created its own twisted form of inheritance, where mothers would systematically prepare their daughters for lives of cosmetic suffering from the earliest age. Princess Isabella of Castile was only 7 years old when her mother began the gradual process of reshaping her daughter's feet, using progressively tighter metal restraints. The child would cry herself to sleep each night as the devices slowly crushed her developing bones, but her mother would comfort her with promises that this suffering would make her the most beautiful princess in all of Europe. These childhood beauty preparations weren't just physical. They were psychological conditioning designed to create adults who would accept extreme suffering as normal. Young princesses would be required to watch their mothers undergo cosmetic procedures, learning that screaming and blood was simply part of being a proper lady. They would practice holding still while heated needles were pressed against their skin, building the pain tolerance they would need for their own future treatments. The most disturbing aspect of this generational transmission was how mothers would often compete with their daughters, viewing them as potential rivals rather than children to protect. Queen Margaret of Anjou became notorious for intensifying her own beauty regimens when her daughter began showing signs of natural beauty, determined to maintain her position as the most beautiful woman in the court, regardless of the cost to her own health or her relationship with her child. Court records reveal instances where mothers would deliberately sabotage their daughters' beauty treatments, providing them with inferior cosmetic materials, or arranging for procedures to be performed incorrectly. This created a cycle of mistrust and competition that poisoned family relationships while ensuring that each generation would surpass the previous one in terms of cosmetic extremism. The education of royal daughters included detailed instruction in pain management techniques that read like training manuals for torture victims. Girls as young as 5 would be taught breathing exercises designed to help them remain conscious during painful procedures, meditation techniques for dissociating from physical suffering, and methods for concealing the evidence of cosmetic treatments from observers. These educational programs created a generation of women who viewed extreme pain as a normal part of daily life. They developed an almost supernatural ability to endure suffering while maintaining perfect composure. But this resilience came at the cost of their ability to form normal emotional connections or experience simple human pleasures without the accompanying expectation of pain. The international marriage market for medieval princesses became increasingly focused on their ability to endure cosmetic suffering rather than their intelligence, political skills, or even their natural beauty. Diplomatic negotiations would include detailed discussions of a princess's pain tolerance, her experience with various cosmetic procedures, and her willingness to undergo additional modifications to meet her future husband's beauty preferences. Marriage contracts began including specific clauses regarding cosmetic obligations, with brides agreeing to undergo particular procedures or maintain certain beauty standards throughout their married lives. These agreements were legally binding and could be used as grounds for divorce or annulment if wives failed to maintain their cosmetic commitments. The transformation of beauty maintenance from personal choice to legal obligation represented the complete institutionalization of cosmetic suffering. The wedding ceremonies themselves became showcases for the most extreme beauty modifications each court could achieve. Brides would undergo intensive cosmetic preparations for months before their ceremonies, timing procedures so that they would reach their peak artificial beauty precisely on their wedding day. The pressure to achieve perfection for these events led to increasingly desperate measures that often resulted in permanent disfigurement or death just days before the ceremony. The honeymoon periods following these weddings were often spent not in romantic intimacy, but in medical recovery as brides healed from their pre-wedding cosmetic ordeals. New husbands would find themselves married to women who were barely conscious from pain medication, covered in bandages, and unable to perform basic functions due to recent procedures. This created additional psychological trauma for both partners as they attempted to begin their marriages under these bizarre circumstances. The pressure to maintain beauty standards during pregnancy created particularly cruel dilemmas for medieval queens. Many would continue their cosmetic treatments even while carrying children, believing that maternal beauty would influence the appearance of their offspring. This led to increased rates of miscarriage and birth defects as toxic cosmetic materials crossed placental barriers and damaged developing babies. Queen Anne of Brittany became infamous for her determination to maintain her mercury-based face treatments throughout her pregnancies, convinced that her pale complexion would ensure beautiful children. The result was a series of miscarriages and stillbirths that were attributed to divine displeasure rather than cosmetic poisoning. Her surviving children were born with developmental disabilities that court physicians privately linked to their mother's beauty obsessions. But these connections were never officially acknowledged. The post-childbirth recovery periods became opportunities for even more extreme cosmetic interventions as queens sought to restore their pre-pregnancy appearances. The physical trauma of medieval childbirth, combined with immediate cosmetic procedures, created mortality rates among royal mothers that far exceeded those of common women. Yet these deaths were rarely attributed to beauty treatments. The development of specialized post-birth beauty recovery chambers represented the pinnacle of medieval cosmetic architecture. These rooms were designed to allow queens to undergo intensive beauty treatments while recovering from childbirth, with features that included drainage systems for blood and other fluids, ventilation for toxic fumes, and restraining devices that could hold patients still during procedures while accommodating their weakened post-birth condition. The servants who worked in these recovery chambers required specialized training in both midwifery and cosmetic procedures, creating a unique profession that combined medical knowledge with beauty expertise. These specialists commanded enormous salaries and were often sworn to secrecy about the procedures they witnessed, creating a closed circle of knowledge about the most extreme aspects of royal beauty culture. The psychological impact of combining childbirth trauma with cosmetic procedures created mental health crises that medieval medicine was completely unprepared to address. Queens would often develop what we would now recognize as severe postpartum depression, complicated by the additional trauma of voluntary cosmetic torture. Many never fully recovered their mental stability, spending their remaining years in states of psychological fragmentation that affected their ability to rule effectively. The influence of these beauty practices on medieval medical understanding was profound but largely negative. Physicians became skilled at treating cosmetic injuries and managing pain from voluntary procedures. But this specialized knowledge came at the expense of developing treatments for actual diseases and medical conditions. The medical profession became increasingly focused on facilitating beauty torture rather than promoting genuine health and wellness. The economic impact of royal beauty culture created entire industries dedicated to producing instruments of cosmetic torture and supplying toxic materials for beauty treatments. Master craftsmen would spend years perfecting devices designed to cause precise amounts of damage to human tissue, while merchants established trade routes specifically for transporting poisonous cosmetic ingredients across continents. These beauty-focused industries employed thousands of people across medieval Europe, creating economic dependencies that made reform almost impossible. Entire regions became economically reliant on producing materials for royal cosmetic treatments, while skilled craftsmen built their reputations on their ability to create increasingly sophisticated instruments of beauty torture. The international competition between courts created an arms race in cosmetic innovation that pushed these practices to ever more extreme levels. When one queen appeared with a particularly dramatic modification, rival courts would immediately begin developing even more extreme versions of the same technique. This competitive pressure ensured that beauty practices would continue escalating in danger and intensity throughout the medieval period. The diplomatic implications of beauty competition created additional pressure for extreme cosmetic practices. Queens understood that appearing at international gatherings with superior beauty modifications could provide significant political advantages, while failing to keep pace with cosmetic innovations could result in diplomatic humiliation and political isolation. The development of cosmetic espionage networks created a shadow world of beauty intelligence where courts would employ spies specifically to gather information about rival queens' cosmetic techniques. These beauty spies would infiltrate foreign courts, sometimes spending years in deep cover to observe and document the most closely guarded beauty secrets of enemy kingdoms. The information gathered by cosmetic spies was treated as state secrets of the highest importance, often more closely guarded than military intelligence or diplomatic communications. The discovery of beauty spies could trigger international incidents and even military conflicts, as courts viewed the theft of cosmetic techniques as acts of war that threatened their competitive advantages. The preservation of beauty knowledge became a crucial aspect of medieval court culture, with elaborate systems developed to document and protect cosmetic innovations. These records were kept in secure archives guarded as carefully as royal treasures, ensuring that each court's beauty advantages could be maintained and passed down to future generations. However, the secretive nature of these beauty practices also meant that much knowledge was lost when key practitioners died, or when political upheavals destroyed court records. This created a cycle where dangerous techniques had to be constantly rediscovered and refined, often at the cost of additional lives and suffering, as new practitioners experimented with imperfectly understood methods. The psychological profile of the physicians and beauty specialists who facilitated these practices reveals the profound moral compromises required to participate in systematic torture, disguised as cosmetic enhancement. Many developed elaborate justifications for their actions, convincing themselves that they were serving higher purposes while privately struggling with the knowledge that they were causing immense suffering. The training required to become skilled in these cosmetic techniques involved a gradual desensitization process that fundamentally altered practitioners' psychological makeup. New apprentices would begin by observing procedures from a distance, gradually being brought closer to the action until they could participate directly without becoming physically ill or emotionally overwhelmed. The most experienced practitioners often displayed personality characteristics that we would now associate with psychopathy, an ability to inflict extreme suffering while maintaining emotional detachment and even deriving satisfaction from their technical expertise. These individuals were highly valued by courts but represented a disturbing example of how institutional systems can create and reward pathological behavior. The international community of beauty practitioners formed their own secretive networks, sharing techniques and innovations while maintaining strict codes of silence about their clients and methods. These professional organizations operated outside normal legal and ethical frameworks, creating parallel societies where extreme cruelty was normalized and even celebrated as artistic achievement. The seasonal cycles of court beauty created predictable patterns of suffering that dominated the annual rhythms of medieval royal life. Winter months became periods of intensive cosmetic intervention when queens could remain hidden while recovering from visible procedures, while spring arrivals at court became showcases for the results of months of beauty torture. The anticipation and preparation for these seasonal beauty reveals created psychological pressure that affected entire court populations. Servants would spend months preparing for the intensive winter beauty seasons, while queens would undergo psychological conditioning to prepare themselves for the ordeals they knew were approaching. The competitive nature of spring beauty reveals meant that each queen had to surpass not only her own previous achievements, but also the innovations developed by rival courts during the winter months. This created an escalating cycle of cosmetic extremism where each season brought new levels of dangerous innovation and human suffering. The documentation of these seasonal beauty cycles in court records provides some of the most detailed accounts of systematic torture in human history. However, because these practices were voluntary and conducted in pursuit of beauty rather than punishment, they have largely escaped historical condemnation despite their horrific nature. The psychological impact of anticipating these seasonal ordeals created year-round anxiety among court populations who understood that each passing season brought them closer to their next period of intensive suffering. This chronic stress contributed to the development of various mental health disorders that medieval medicine was unable to understand or treat effectively. The servants and practitioners who participated in these seasonal beauty cycles often developed their own psychological coping mechanisms, including elaborate rituals designed to distance themselves emotionally from the suffering they were causing or witnessing. These coping strategies created their own forms of psychological damage, while allowing the system of beauty torture to continue functioning. The legacy of medieval beauty culture extended far beyond the individual queens who practiced these techniques, influencing European concepts of beauty, suffering, and feminine perfection for centuries to come. However, the systematic nature of this historical documentation was deliberately obscured by later generations who recognized the disturbing implications of these practices for medieval society as a whole. The gradual abandonment of the most extreme medieval beauty practices occurred not through moral awakening, but through practical considerations, as courts realized that dead or permanently disabled queens could not fulfill their political functions effectively. The transition away from these practices was slow and incomplete, with many dangerous techniques persisting in modified forms well into the modern era. The historical record of medieval beauty culture serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly human societies can normalize extreme cruelty when it becomes institutionalized and economically profitable. The willing participation of entire court systems in systematic torture demonstrates the dangerous power of cultural conditioning and competitive pressure to override basic human compassion and ethical reasoning. Today, as we examine our own beauty standards and cosmetic practices, the medieval example provides a sobering perspective on the potential dangers of pursuing physical perfection at any cost. While modern cosmetic procedures are generally safer than their medieval predecessors, the underlying psychology that drives people to accept pain and risk in pursuit of beauty remains fundamentally unchanged. The queens who subjected themselves to these horrific beauty rituals were not simply vain or foolish. They were trapped in systems that made their physical appearance a matter of political survival and personal identity. Their willingness to endure unimaginable suffering in pursuit of beauty speaks to the profound power of social expectations and cultural pressure to shape human behavior in ways that defy rational self-interest. Perhaps most importantly, these forgotten stories remind us that the pursuit of beauty, when taken to extremes, becomes indistinguishable from self-destruction. The medieval queens who died slowly from cosmetic poisoning, or who lived in constant agony from beauty modifications, were not achieving true beauty. They were sacrificing their humanity on the altar of impossible standards that no amount of suffering could ever truly satisfy. The haunting legacy of medieval beauty culture continues to echo through history, reminding us that behind every impossible standard of perfection lies a human cost that is rarely acknowledged or understood. These queens paid the ultimate price for beauty, and their stories deserve to be remembered not as curiosities from a distant past, but as warnings about the dangerous extremes to which the pursuit of physical perfection can lead when unchecked by wisdom, compassion, or basic human decency.